We are studying Rambam's magisterial introduction to Mishnah. The great Idol, as he is known, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimonides, the Rambam, he wrote this incredible work known as the commentary to Mishnah. And we are trying to navigate his introduction to his commentary to Mishnah, which so far has given us tremendous insight into the nature and the content and the structure of the Mishnah and the history of oral Torah and the methodology of oral Torah and the little sidebar that he gave us about prophecy. And then last time we learned about the composition of oral Torah, the 5 different components of the oral Torah, and how dispute fits into it, and how halacha lemoshe misinai, the laws that are given to us from Moshe at Sinai, how they fit into it, where exactly you will find dispute, where you will not find dispute, and so on. Now we understand what is included in the Mishnah. In the next section, he goes through all the books of the Mishnah and explains the organization and the sequencing of these books. This will, I think, provide us a tremendous insight, a little window into an enormous corpus of literature, the Mishnah. It will take us a long time to study all of Mishnah together, but this is an opportunity for us to get a little snapshot, a little overview of this incredible and canonical corpus of oral Torah. So the Rambam tells us that when the organizer, the architect of the Mishnah, namely Rabbi Judah the Prince, when he decided to indeed codify the Mishnah, he decided to divide it up into 6 general sections, known as the Shisha Sidarm, the 6 orders. Perhaps you've heard the term Shas. The word Shas, which means all of Talmud or all of Mishnah, it actually is an acronym, Shisha Sidarm, 6 orders, the 6 general sections of the oral Torah of the Mishnah. The first section are laws that relate to things that grow from the ground, agricultural laws, laws of Shemitah, Arla, Teruma, the various different tithes, the tithe to the Kohen, the Truma, the tithe to the Levite, the Meiser, and so on. The next section is all the laws that relate to time. So the festivals, the Shabbos, and so on, what's permitted, what's forbidden, what's prohibited on these days. So Shabbos and Passover, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, each one has their own book, the book of Sukkah, and so on. That is the next section, section number 2. The third section are all the laws that relate to marriage. And that includes the Levirate marriage and the laws of marital contracts and the effectuation of marriage, Kedushin, and the dissolution of marriage, i.e. divorce and so on. That's the third section of laws. The fourth section is known as Nizikin, which is laws of interpersonal commerce, damages, partnerships, and so on, ownership of land. That's the fourth section. The fifth is sacrifices, all the many laws of sacrifices. And finally, the sixth order, that is the laws of purity and its opposite. He doesn't want to say the word impurity. He just says purity and the thing which is not purity, and we know what that means. That means impurity. So 6 orders, 6 sections, Shisha, which means 6, Shisha Sidarim. The first Seder, the first order is Ziraim, agriculture. The next one is Moed, which means time. The third one is Nashim, which means women, marriage. The fourth one is Nizit, which means damages. The fifth one is Kachim, which means holies or sacrifices. And finally, Taharos, which means purities. Now, the Rambam himself, throughout all of his writings, is renowned for his extreme precision, both in language and in structure and organization. So all students of the Rambam know that if he places a law that seems out of place, the location and the sequencing of a given law will reveal to you a lot of the nature and the essence of said law. So the students of the Rambam can derive a lot of information, a lot of insight from just the placement of a given law. It's always going to be extraordinarily well organized. And he himself is doing that sort of treatment for this enormous body of the Mishnah. in his introduction to the Mishnah, he's going to give us a masterclass of the precision and the wisdom behind the order and the structure and the sequencing of these various orders, these various sections. And even within these 6 sections are going to be laws organized as books, as mesechtas, as tractates, and divided up into chapters and divided up into subchapters into individual laws or mishnahs. Why is the first order agriculture, planting? Well, he explains that these laws relate to food, and all living things need food. And just as it is impossible for a person to live without food, it's not possible for them to serve their God, to serve the Almighty without sustenance and nourishment. And because this is a prerequisite for service of God, it comes first. Well, if that's the first major section, what comes next? Next is the order of festivals, of moed, of time-related laws. And why is that? Because that's how it's organized in the Torah. If you look at Exodus chapter 23, it talks about laws related to agriculture. It talks about the laws of the Shemitah. And right afterwards, it talks about the laws of Shabbos. 6 days you work, the 7th day is Shabbos. It starts off with 6 years you work the field, the 7th is Shemitah. It starts off with laws of agriculture. Then it talks about laws of time, and therefore the architect of the Mishnah says, I'll just follow what the Torah's sequencing is. First, the laws of agriculture, then the laws of time. Well, using that same methodology, the architect of the Mishnah said, well, the order of women, of marriage, that follows in the sequencing of the Torah. It follows the festivals, and therefore you'll have agriculture, festivals, and then the section of women, marriage and divorce, and so on. Followed by the order of the Torah, which is damages and interpersonal commerce, business, and partnership. Now, the last 2 of the sections of the orders don't appear in the book of Exodus. Rather, they appear in the book of Leviticus, and that's why they will be the second to last, the penultimate and the last ones. And if you look at Leviticus, first it talks about sacrifices, then it talks about purity and impurity, and therefore first the architect of the Mishnah organized the order of kachim, which is the order of sacrifices, of holies, and then there is taharos, which is the order of purity and its opposite. Now, of course, the Mishnah is not just ordered as 6 mega sections. It is broken down further into smaller sections. Each one of these 6 main subjects has many details, and all laws of a general concept are going to be included in one book known as a masechta. In English, I think it's called a tractate. It's a book. And then he organized it further. Not just a book, but a book broken down into chapters where details, similar details of a different concept, are bunched into chapters. And then it is further organized into smaller and more digestible laws. He calls it a halacha. It's commonly known as a Mishnah. So that's the general picture of the Mishnah. All of oral Torah, again, the 5 different components that we learned last time, are all divided up in this mega project known as the Mishnah. Now, in these 6 sessions, we have around 60 books. It depends exactly how you count. And even they are specifically ordered. So if you zoom in on the first order, that of Zeraim, of agriculture, agrarian laws, you'll have 11 books and a very specific order. Why is that order thus done? Now, before we go through the order, I want to very briefly give a little overview in each one of these books. We have 11 books. In this first order, this first section on Zeraim, agriculture, and the first book of the first section, meaning the opening book of the codification of oral Torah, is the book of Brachos. Brachos means blessings. This project begins with blessings. Now, what is a blessing? A blessing is something that you say that has the words Baruch Atah Hashem, blessed are you, God. And a blessing will either begin or end, or begin and end with that specific formulation. Now, there are different types of blessings. Of course, we know. Before you eat something, before you drink something, before you enjoy some of God's gifts, you say a blessing. You say a blessing before you eat, before you drink, and after you eat, and after you drink. Birchas hanenim. There are blessings that you say before you perform a mitzvah, before you affix a mezuzah on your doorpost, before you wrap tefillin, before you shake the lulav. There is a blessing that you say. That's a second category, known as Birchas HaMitzvos. And finally, prayer. Much of prayer, of course, is in the form of blessings. You praise God, you thank God, you ask God to fulfill your needs, and there's also a final section, that of blessings for awe-inspiring experiences. That's what blessings is, the first book. Now, you open up the book, it begins with the laws of Shema. What's the Shema? Shema, of course, is 3 paragraphs in the Torah. 2 from the book of Devarim, 1 from the book of Bamidbar. And this is a biblical obligation to recite this twice a day. Once in the morning and once at night. Now, because this is a mitzvah, there are also blessings associated with that mitzvah, as is true with many mitzvahs. Many mitzvahs, you have a blessing that is associated with it. So if you look at the morning prayer book, and you'll see the Shema, and you'll see blessings before it and blessings after it, both by day and by night. So the book is blessings, and you're going to talk about, of course, the blessings of the Shema, but it makes sense to talk about the Shema itself before you talk about the blessings of the Shema. And that's why the first subject addressed in the Mishnah, in the canonization of the oral Torah, is that of the Shema and its blessings. And then there's the Amidah prayer, which is the central component of prayer. And that is, of course, the 18/19 blessings. There is a requirement to pray every day. And in antiquity, for the first almost 1,000 years, after the nation received the Torah at Sinai, there wasn't a specific text that everyone said. Every person was allowed to ad-lib, pray, talk to God. And that's, of course, the heart of prayer, the essence of prayer. But when the era of prophecy was waning, there was a decision by the last of the prophets, the men of the great assembly, to codify and to canonize the authoritative and universal text of prayer. And that's known as the Shemona Esrei, the 18 benedictions of prayer. Now, about 500 years later, there was a 19th blessing that was added, the Birchas Aminim, which means the blessing of the apostates, of the heretics. It was a way to weed out, to ferret out heretics and apostates in our midst. We asked them to pray, and there's a blessing of cursing the heretics. If they're not willing to say that prayer, maybe they should be suspected. This is the Amidah prayer, 18/19 blessings. It's recited 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. Why is it morning, afternoon, evening? It's either corresponding to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or it's corresponding to the daily Tamid sacrifice offerings. There was a morning sacrifice, Tamid, a communal offering of the sacrifice. And that corresponds to Shachris. There's the afternoon sacrifice, and that corresponds to Mincha. And then there's the evening processing of the sacrifices, and that corresponds to the evening prayer. Now, of course, on festivals, on special days, there are extra sacrifices that are offered, extra communal sacrifices that are offered, and therefore there's the extra prayer that corresponds to that, the Musaf prayer. Next is the blessings on food and drink. And this is not generic blessings. In fact, there are 6 different food categories. And each one has a different blessing for what you say before you consume that food or drink. And there are 3 different types of blessings that come after eating, again, depending on the type and the volume of what you ate/drank. If someone experiences something awesome, there are various blessings to say, like a meteor, an earthquake, thunder and lightning, and so on, a great sea, a great mountain, a place where miracles were performed for our antecedents. There are various different blessings that apply in these situations. These are opportunities to recognize the Almighty's dominion and supremacy and power, and a blessing to appreciate them was instituted. It is noteworthy that the lion's share of blessings that we say and that are included in this book are actually of rabbinic origin. Prayer is not necessarily structured as blessings. So even though there is a biblical requirement to pray every day, at least according to some opinions, the nature of that prayer is not necessarily that of blessing. There's only one blessing that is of biblical origin that was not instituted and codified by the rabbis, and that is a blessing after a bread meal, after a sustaining meal, v'achalta, v'savata, uverachta. When you eat and you are satiated, then you must bless. That is a verse in Scripture, and that is the only biblical prayer. That's the first book of the first order of the Mishnah. The next book is known as Peah. Peah means like a corner or an edge of the field. This refers to the mitzvah to give some of your produce, your crops, to the poor. Specifically, Leviticus chapter 19 tells us, you leave the corner of the field for the poor. And that's only one of the gifts that are given to the poor. The edge of the field, which is unharvested and is given to the poor to collect. How much, of course? How much must be left unharvested? The Torah does not say. The rabbinical minimum established is a 60th of the crop. And this applies to all crops, not only the 7 special species that the land of Israel is praised with. And that's one category of law that is discussed in this book. There are other types of gifts given to the poor. The idea of leket. Leket refers to stalks that fall down when the farmer is harvesting his grain. Suppose a farmer grabs a handful of stalks and uses the sickle to cut it, and as he does so, some stalks fall to the ground. So if 1 or 2 stalks fall, it must be left to the poor. It's leket. If 3 or more fall, then the farmer may collect it. And of course, the farmer is not allowed, if you by mistake drop 1 or 2, I'll drop 3 more and then I'll be able to collect it myself. That is a prohibition. Now, where does this apply to? This applies to grain, to legumes, but not to fruit trees. And there's another gift of the poor known as shikha, which means forgetfulness. If a farmer forgets a bundle of produce in the field, or if there's some produce that the harvester overlooked, forgot to cut, those 2 forgotten harvests are left for the poor. So this is known as leket, shikha, and peah, different types of biblically mandated gifts that come to harvesting your field. You must leave it or give it for the poor. Now, there are other laws that apply not to all crops, but to vineyards specifically. Individual grapes that fall down, the farmers removing their cluster of grapes, and some individual grapes fall down, they must be left for the poor to retrieve. In addition, underdeveloped clusters of grapes are also left for the poor. These are not distributed by the farmer. It's not like a typical tithe where you remove a portion of your income, of your produce, and give it to the recipient of the tithe. This is actually just left for the poor. They come and they collect it. That is the second book. The third book, also related to tithes. This is the book called Demai. Now, it's important to stress, the word tithe in our head, it conjures a nice, generous gift that we can give to someone who's less fortunate. The Torah system and sequencing of tithing is an obligation. So if you have produce that must be tithed and you don't tithe it, well, that food cannot be consumed. It's effectively not kosher. It's known as tevel in Mishnaic literature. So if I buy crops from a seller, if that was not tithed properly, I cannot consume said crops. So what do I do if I buy crops from someone and I don't know if they tithed it or not? Must I tithe it myself to cover for the possibility that maybe they didn't tithe it properly? Now, it's important to know there's all sorts of different tithes. The first tithe that's given is known as teruma. This is given to the priest. Which priest? Whichever priest you want. Your buddy's a priest, you give him the tithe, the truma tithe. How much is given? So, we're told there's 3 different amounts. If you're generous, you give a 40th. If you're less generous, you give a 50th, 2%. If you are miserly, you give a 60th. And that tithing given to the Kohen, it's known as truma. It's sanctified. It can be consumed only by the priest and their families. And they must be in a state of purity. The food must be pure. They must be pure in order for it to be consumed. Well, after truma is given, so I had 100%, now I have 98% of my yield. Then there's the first tithe, the Meiser Rishon, the first tithe. 10% of what remains is given to the Levite. Which Levite? Whichever Levite I want to give to. And of course, the Levites will come and say, can I help you a little bit? They'd sidle up to the owners. Well, maybe you need some help. We're pals. Don't forget me. That's the Levites don't have a portion of the land, you recall. When the mighty distributed the land, the Levites did not get a portion. They are supported via these tithes. The first tithe is 10% of what remains post-truma, post the 2% given to the Kohen, that's given to the Levite. Now, the Levite himself has to further tithe it to the Kohen, which is the 1%, 10% and 1% and 10% of that. So 10% of 10% is 1%. 1% would go back to the Kohen in the form of a tithe that the Levite gives to the Kohen. That's known as the Trumas Meiser. You can see it's starting to get a little complicated, right? We have the tithe to the Kohen, 2%, the Truma. The tithe to the Levite, 10% of that. And the Levite, of the 10% he received from the Israelite, he gives 10% of that to the Kohen. And then there's the second tithe. Now, the second tithe doesn't really sound like a tithe to us, because the second tithe is 10% of what remains post what you gave to the Kohen and post what you gave to the Levite. So if you had 100 units, 2% went to the Kohen, and then 9.8 units went to the Levite. And then 10% of what remains is separated as a second tithe, but that you keep. And you eat it in Jerusalem. It's consumed by the owner and his family in Jerusalem. You bring it there for the pilgrimage, for the festivals. That food is what you eat over the course of those festivals. Now, if you have too much, you have, hundreds, thousands of bushels, you're not going to schlep it all to Jerusalem. You could actually sell it, convert the second tithe into money. You monetize the tithe. You take the money to Jerusalem and you use that to buy food and other things to enjoy in Jerusalem on the festivals, on the pilgrimages with your family. Truma to the Kohen, first tithe to the Levite. The Levite himself gives the Trumas Meiser to the Kohen. And now the second tithe, well, that's given to yourself, to you and your family. Bring it to Jerusalem, consume it in Jerusalem. That is the schedule of tithing on years 1, 2, 4, and 5 of the Shemitah cycle. On years 3 and 6, instead of a second tithe where you take 10% of what remains following the first two tithes. Bring it to Jerusalem, 10% of what remains is given to the poor person. That's the tithe of the poor. On years 3 and 6, instead of a second tithe, there's a tithe of the poor. 10% of what remains is given to the impoverished. Lots of details in order to have untithed or fully tithed produce for you to eat however you wish. The tractate of Demai talks about buying crops of unknown tithing status from someone that you may suspect didn't tithe properly. If there's someone who's very learned, very righteous, we can assume that they fully tithed their crops before selling it, obviously. However, when you buy from an ignoramus, and he may say, I tithed it perfectly. I gave 2% to the Kohen, and I gave 10% to the Levite, and I gave 10% to the Meiser Sheni, the second tithe, on years 1, 2, 4, and 5, and on years 3 and 6, I gave 10% to the poor person. But you don't know. The word demai is a mashup of da, which means this, mai, what? We don't know what's the status of this. It's unknown, the status of this produce. And we, the law states, can assume that everyone knows 2% goes to the Kohen. Even the ignoramus keeps that. What happens beyond that, 98%, in that there's a doubt. And therefore there are the laws of Demai as detailed in the book of Demai, what to do and how to ensure that in the event that it was not tithed, you can separate the tithe, not necessarily give it, but you do an act of tithing, and that's how you discharge your responsibility as the purchaser of crops of unknown tithing status. And there's a little bit of a cool insight. If you're a Levite, you want your 10%. That's owed to you by right. So you can come to the person and say, well, you bought this from the ignoramus. Ignoramus didn't give 10%. Now, we don't know if he did or if he didn't, right? If we knew for sure, then it's not Demai, it's Tevel. But we don't know for sure. So the Levite would say, well, I want 10% because he didn't tithe it. You could tell the Levite, well, I don't know if he tithed it, but maybe he did. You're coming to extract 10% of my product. You have to prove that he didn't tithe it. And because the obligation, the onus, is on the person who's coming to extract, not from the person who is the current holder of these 10%, of this 10% of would-be tithes, therefore you actually just separate it, but you could keep it unless the Levite or any Levite can prove, which of course they can't, but can prove that this was untithed. That is the subject of the book of Demai. The next book is Kilayim, which means mixtures, intermingling. There are all sorts of things that are okay. But once you mix them with something else, it's not okay. So the classic example, milk, it's fine. It's kosher. Meat, it's fine. It's kosher. Again, provided all the laws are fulfilled. But the mixture of milk and meat is prohibited, as we know. A cow, that's okay. A donkey, that's okay. You cannot, however, put them both under a yoke and have them plow the field together. You cannot have animals of different species plow a field together. It's okay to own a horse. It's okay to own a donkey. It's prohibited to mate these two together to produce a mule. A wool garment, perfectly fine. Very handsome, very dapper. A linen garment, amazing, very cool and breathable. Of course, there's shatnez, kilayim, when there's a mixture of the two. Planting seeds is encouraged. Planting wheat and barley and so on, all encouraged. However, you cannot mix and graft different species into each other, different grains into each other. You can't graft different species of plant onto another. You can't plant different grains, different vegetables, the seeds together where it creates some sort of hybrid, some sort of chimera. Now, all the laws of mixture are effectively in one verse, 19:19 of Leviticus. Your animal, you shall not mate, kilayim, meaning a mixture. Your field, you should not plant, kilayim, a mixture. A garment of shatnez, mixture, you should not make. This idea of different things that cannot be mixed together. Now we have one verse in Scripture, and typically, or as can be typical, we have a whole book of Mishnah that you can spend a lot of time studying, the book of Kilayim, the book of laws of mixtures. Now, interestingly, even though we talked about milk and meat, it's not really considered Kilayim. That is found later on in other tractates, specifically that of Chulin, which is much later on in the order of holies of Kachim. Now, of course, there are many details, but like the distance that has to be placed between different species. What about the result? If you graft and create some new, or someone else does it, someone else creates a new fruit or a new vegetable that's a mixture of two different vegetables, even though you're not allowed to do it, that product is not necessarily prohibited. So mixing animals, mixing fabrics, mixing different species, working with different species, that is the subject of the book of Kilayim. Next is the book of Shavias, which means the seventh year, the Shemitah year. On the seventh year, we cannot do any work in the field. We must allow the land to lie fallow. We cannot do any business with the crops of the seventh year. And of course, this book details all the laws. It's, as you would expect, to be quite voluminous. What's biblically prohibited, what's rabbinically prohibited, as we mentioned, there are rabbinic edicts and decrees that are there to reinforce a Torah law. So even though there are some things that would be permitted from a biblical standpoint to do on the seventh year, those things may be forbidden by rabbinic edict. So watering plants, clearing fields, the rabbis prohibited anything that would improve the land or the plants, but anything which just maintains its health and ensures that it does not regress, that would not be included in the rabbinic edicts. Interestingly, although the laws of Shemitah apply on the seventh year, it can actually apply on the sixth year as well. You must stop doing work before the seventh year commences. And specifically, any work done to a field that will no longer benefit that year's products, it's just preparation for the next year, that's already prohibited in year 6. So Passover time of year 6, well, that year's crops are already done. Any work done now in the field is preparation for for year 7, that would be prohibited. And of course, a fruit field and an ordinary field will be different. All sorts of other laws. You must abandon the Shemitah crop. You cannot put a lock on your gate or block public access to your field. The doors must be open to anyone to come and to take what they want. Of course, you as the owner can also take what you want, but you cannot hold it all to yourself. The product of year 7 is sacred and it can be eaten, but it cannot be wasted. It cannot be used for commerce. You must remove from your house any species that's no longer plentiful in the field. Meaning, if it's no longer out in the field, you cannot keep it and harbor it in your house. And finally, there's one more law that is relevant to year 7, the nullification of personal loans. We mentioned this very briefly last time. There is the institution of the pruzbol. Pruzbol is a halachic device where a person takes a loan and gives it to someone else to be like the steward of it, to oversee it. So personal loans are annulled at the end of the Shemitah year, but loans, let's say, that are owed to the court, well, those are not annulled. Just like you can't, discharge student loans by personal bankruptcy. Just it's owned by the government. It doesn't work with the same rules as other loans. And Hill instituted the system of the pruzbol as a way to offset the annulment of personal loans at the end of the 7th year to avoid the cancellation. Absent that halachic device, all personal loans are annulled at the end of the Shemitah. We have the book of Truma. We mentioned already Truma. That's the first tithe, somewhere between a 40th and a 60th, which is given to the priest. What's included? grain, wine, and oil, are other produce, are all other types of produce included as well on a biblical scale or only from a rabbinic perspective? How much must be separated by biblical law? Even a single grain, a single kernel of grain can discharge a person's responsibility of truma in practicality. The expected amount, the average amount, is a 50th. A miser gives a 60th, and a generous person would give a 40th. What's done with it? It's eaten by the Kohen and the members of his household. A non-Kohen who tries to eat this food is guilty of a capital crime, just of course one that's not adjudicated by the human court, but rather by the divine court. What happens if the truma gets mixed up with ordinary food? You have a bushel of truma and there's 10 bushels of non-truma, and it's all mixed up together. So that can only be eaten by a Kohen because you don't know if it's truma or non-truma. That's a very interesting subcategory of laws. Even though most agricultural laws apply only in the land of Israel, the laws of truma would apply outside the land of Israel as well, in some places based upon the rabbinic edicts in Babylon, in the lands of Ammon and Moab, in Egypt, and even in the laws in the lands of Syria. I guess Jews used to live there. The next two books really about the tithes. You have the book of Maasros, which means the tithing. It's actually at what stage in the development of the product is it tithable. Once it becomes edible, you cannot eat it without being tithed. You could snack upon it. Once it's fully processed, it's ripened, it's ready to be harvested, then you cannot even snack upon it if you're going to sell it, but you can still snack on it if you're going to keep it for yourself. Once it goes into your house, well, then it's now completely untouchable until it is fully tithed. There's actually an interesting quirk and loophole. The Torah states that once it enters the face of your house, then it becomes fully obligated by the laws of tithing. Well, suppose it doesn't come in through the front entrance. It goes through the back entrance. It goes through the roof. Doesn't see the face of the house. That might be a loophole by which a person can avoid triggering the applicability of tithing. The next book is Meiser Sheni, which is the second tithe brought to Jerusalem and consumed in Jerusalem. It can be redeemed. How do you ensure that it's fairly redeemed? How do you ensure that when you take your enormous amount of second tithing product and you convert it to money, that it's actually a fair conversion? Different ways, different methods by which it can be redeemed. How to ensure that it's fairly redeemed, where it can be redeemed, and so on. The book of Challah talks about Challah, which is the tithe that applies not to grain, but to dough. After the grain is made into flour, it's made into a dough. A portion of it is given to the Kohen. Different types of bread, cooked, fried, are not included, only those that are baked. Who can eat it? Who cannot eat it? What happens to the dough that's untithed? All sorts of laws. Is this applicable to the land of Israel only? Is this also true in the land outside of Israel? That's the book of Challah. Arla, the book of Arla talks about the prohibition against consumption of fruits from a tree in its first 3 years. You plant a tree for the first 3 years. Its fruits are prohibited. It's known as Arla. The word Arla actually means uncircumcised, means it's like covered up. You cannot eat it. On the 4th year, it's known as Netta Revai, the 4th year's products. And that year's batch, it's holy, it must be consumed at Jerusalem. Now, where does this apply to? Only fruits of the tree. When do you start counting? When's the tree's birthday, and so on? What about the wood, the leaves of the tree? Only the fruit is prohibited. What is done with the fruits of those trees? Is this applicable in the land of Israel or also outside the land of Israel? What happens when non-Arla fruit is mixed together with Arla fruit? Can it be nullified? Under what circumstances? With what ratio? And so on. Finally, the last book of this order is Bikurim. That's the first fruits. The first fruits of the 7 special species that the land of Israel is praised with: wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. These 7 special species are brought to Jerusalem in an elaborate ceremony, in an ornate basket. It's presented to the Kohen. And there's a special passage that is recited by the owner, and the fruits are given to the priests who are working, who are serving in the temple during that week. This is the butz and the laws, the general, of course, very, very brief overview of the laws that are included in the first order, the order of Zeraim, the agricultural laws in the Mishnah. Now, the Rambam doesn't just subsist with telling us why the order of Zeraim goes first. He actually goes through book by book. And he says that the first book is brachos, that deals with food, blessings and foods. And then he tells us, very interesting, an expert physician, when he gives an instruction to a sickly patient for how to restore their health, the first thing he says he talks about is the diet. Only then does he begin to give other diagnoses. Got to improve your diet first. Similarly, the architect of the Mishnah, the first thing he addresses is the diet. And the spiritual diet that we have is that when you eat something, you must make sure that you are taking it with permission from God, and that's only via a blessing. Unless you prepare the food for consumption. Now, the only mitzvah that he says, this is interesting because the Rambam seems to contradict himself. But why does it start with the laws of the Shema? Because this, he tells us, there's no other mitzvah that a person is obligated in it every single day. Only the Shema. And the blessings of the Shema are going to be addressed in the Book of Blessings, but you cannot speak about the blessings of the Shema before you speak about the Shema itself. And that's why the first book and the first subject of the first book is going to be blessings and the blessings of the Shema and the Shema itself. And then you have the laws of Peah. Recall that's the corner or the edge of the field that's left for the poor person, the leket, shikha, Peah, the dropped stalks, and so on. Well, why is that the next subject? Because this is almost like a tithe that you give before the harvest. Almost all tithes go into effect only after the harvest. This is done before the harvest, and therefore it comes first. Well, who receives the Peah? That's the poor person. Demai, that's, you recall, that's when you buy products from an ignoramus. That too is distributed to the poor under certain circumstances, and therefore it's related to Peah, comes next. And then Kilayim, well, that's organized by the Torah in that fashion. It talks first about Peah and then about Kilayim, and therefore that's why that comes next. And then he explains, well, Arla really should have been next, but Arla is not obligatory. If someone doesn't plant any fruit trees, you don't have the obligation to have the first 3 years of the fruit trees being untouchable. Shemitah, however, is obligatory upon everyone, and therefore it comes next. And then comes Truma, because that's the first tithe, and then comes Maisa, which is the next tithe, the Maisa Sheni, which is the third tithe, and then Challah, well, that is done from the actual dough, post all the tithings, and then comes Arla, and then comes Bikurim, because that is how it is organized in the Torah. So what do we have? We have our little taste, a little foray, a first foray into the laws of the Mishnah. In the Rambam's introduction to the Mishnah, he tells us what the Mishnah is composed of, what are the components, what are the laws that were gathered and organized with great precision in the first codification of the oral Torah in the Mishnah. And we have the first section, 6 sections in total. The first order is that of Zeraim, which is agricultural laws. And we learned about the 11 different books that make up this section. We learned a little bit about the content of the laws of each one of these books and why they were thus ordered. We still have, of course, a lot to go. We have the upcoming 5 orders. We started with Zeraim, agriculture, and next on our list, please God, with the help of the Almighty, is Moed, the books that are included in the order of Mishnah related to time-bound festivals, Shabbos, Passover, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkah. These are all different books. Chadija, as we shall see, Moed Katan, as we shall see, Tainus, as we shall see. Many, many exciting books and many wonderful laws. Hopefully this will give us a broader understanding of the scope and the breadth of the Torah and the oral Torah, and of course, the Mishnah. I look forward to continuing our exploration of this Rambam's introduction to Mishnah, and to get a little bit of a taste and a flavor and overview of the wonderful books included in this magnificent corpus, this authoritative corpus of Mishnah, and not only the content, but also the sequencing and the ordering. Our education continues with the help of the Almighty. My email address is rabbiwalby@gmail.com.